Hello, and welcome to another video about how to make your UX practice successful. Today I want to take on a big topic, and that topic is Agile. Now, Agile is all the rage, and it has been for some time, and Agile is a great methodology, but it can be a little scary if you're a UX designer trying to figure out where you fit into the Agile universe. And so the purpose of this video is to give you some guidance early on, just some sort of fundamental tenets about how to take the UX practice and adapt it to the Agile process. And there's kind of the reverse happening, which is Agile needs to adapt a little bit to the UX process so that they can coexist. So I want to go back to first principles here, and this is to look at the original Agile manifesto, and it contained 12 points. Here's the very first one. Our highest priority is to satisfy the customer through early and continuous delivery of valuable software. Well, that sounds pretty good. Not much we can argue about that. We always want to prioritize who we call the user, but the customer. We welcome changing requirements, even late in development. Well, that's a real strength of Agile. That's exactly why you want to adopt Agile, and it's amazing. And actually has pretty serious implications for user experience. But it's actually not clear what those implications are from this. And then deliver working software frequently. Again, nothing really you can object to. And we go down all 12 of them, it's the same thing. They're really strong, they're really good. It puts together a very compelling picture, but it really gives virtually no guidance about how to integrate UX into Agile. And I think the reason for that is that the original authors of the Agile Manifesto, which is probably at least 20 years ago now, weren't really thinking about UX, and UX was really not a practice at the time. And what I've noticed, I've met multiple teachers of Agile, they often also don't know much about UX, and that's kind of where the issue comes. So this is kind of my 2 cents about how UX and Agile fit. So we'll get on to the myth part. The first myth is that really anyone could just do the UX design, and that includes any of the pigs, that is the people on the team. One of the things that's very important for some Agile practicers is the idea that everyone's a generalist and that everybody should be able to do everything. And that means all developers should be able to work on different parts of things, and they should be able to, for example, test. The example being that if the tester is behind, that the developer, rather than coding more stuff to get everything into a done state, they should start testing. And I have no issue with that at all. However, the idea that if the UX designer is behind, that the developer or Scrum Master or anybody else should start doing the UX design work, I definitely have an issue with that. UX design is a very specialized skill, and Agile really cannot change that. If you want to just take a really intuitive example, if, let's say, logos need to be done, should the developers start making the logos? I mean, do they even have Illustrator on their machine? And if they do, they can be quite dangerous. So UX design is absolutely a specialized field, and the UX designer ultimately needs to be responsible for the UX. Now, of course, the team is ultimately responsible for getting work done, but you shouldn't have other members of the team trying to do the UX designer's job. That really will not work out. Another big issue with Agile has to do with planning, and I think the original founders really took issue with the idea that someone would start a long time planning and writing documents that no one would read and going through approvals, and they really wanted to stress talking to customers, building stuff, talking to customers more, building more, and really emphasize building. And that really sounds great, but our entire field, our entire methodology is based on doing upfront work. So for example, requirement gathering. I mean, you simply cannot do requirement gathering inside a sprint, otherwise you're really only going to get a tiny amount of the requirements. Similarly, product ideation takes a long time, and things need to bake. So if you were to just start a project without doing any of these things, without gathering any requirements, without thinking about what you're actually going to build, but what the shape of it is going to be, then in my opinion, from a UX point of view, you're going to end up with gibberish. It's not going to be a good result. So somehow you need to meld this concept of UX process and planning with the Agile idea that you want to start building as soon as possible. And you'll see out there something called Sprint Zero. People are referring to it, and Sprint Zero is what's a planning phase. And Sprint Zero can be really helpful, but it is a bit of a misnomer in that it's not like Sprint Zero and Sprint One and Sprint 2 and Sprint 3 are all the same. Sprint 0 is sort of categorically different than the rest of the sprints because, first of all, it can last any duration, and also there are a lot of things that go on that aren't really all that Agile-like. And the third thing to keep in mind is that UX design is at least partially a creative endeavor. Now, UX design is also solving business problems, and therefore it's also part of a development methodology, but it is also fundamentally creative. And Agile has a tendency to want to break everything up into sprints and to start measuring by getting story points in there, assigning story points to every little thing, and then further subdividing. There's actually a principle to really try to subdivide to as few story points as possible. And I mean, for something that is essentially that can be a creative endeavor, that really doesn't work. You do need time for ideas to bake and for ideas to incubate. Incubation is a core part of the creative process. Now, so that means the UX design needs to work with Agile teams to figure out how they can get that time. And again, that's where I was kind of stressing the Sprint 0 or sometimes before everything is beginning, where that incubation period can happen and the creative can have some time to stretch their legs and really think about the problem in multiple ways. So now I'm going to go into a bonus myth, and this has to do with documentation. Definitely Agile has a very strong restriction, well, not restriction, but it has a negative predisposition towards documentation. And that's, a good idea in that a lot of people generate documentation for like no good reason. What is definitely true, though, is that the emphasis of documentation becomes problematic for other people outside of the team. That's who the chickens are. Specifically, I found that other people who want to understand what has been built and what the software is have a bit of an issue. Where previously we were creating prototypes or creating specifications or wireframes, there was some kind of artifact that actually specifically referred to what was being built. In Agile, most of that stuff gets put into various stories, and it's all there. It's just impossible for a chicken really to understand and read, and often they won't even have access to the system. So this isn't to say that you should all of a sudden just start making documentation for the sake of it, because it really doesn't work in Agile, and you're going to have to use the story pointing system. But it's just to point out that it's actually a bit of a problem when there isn't documentation at the end of the process. And another person who suffers is the future you, and that can be the actual you, the designer that comes back to the project and wonders what exactly is going on, or it could be just a future designer or a future team working on it and wanting to understand, well, what is it exactly, what was the idea and what was the intent behind all of this designing. And if you don't create a design document that contains all that information, then a lot of that reasoning and specification is just sort of lost to time. Again, there isn't really a good solution to this, or none that I've seen, but don't necessarily think of ridding yourself of all types of documentation as a really wonderful thing, because actually it definitely has some downsides, and so that's important to keep in mind. Well, I hope you found that interesting and useful. Feel free to give me a shout if you have any questions. Thank you.